Adesanya lost his middleweight title to Pereira recently, and since then has been plotting his revenge. The man from the land down under doesn't want to stay down and has reignited his rivalry with the Brazilian. Today, we're going to be discussing the thoughts of his coach and how they're planning to get back on top of the UFC middleweight ladder. First, let's look at what Eugene Bareman has to say about the rematch. Israel Adesanya's coach, Eugene Bareman, is already preparing for their rematch with their Brazilian nightmare. Adesanya lost his championship belt to his longtime rival, Alex Pereira, in their most recent battle inside the octagon. In an interview with Submission Radio, Bareman said that they're quietly confident for the rematch and that they'll have another go at the Brazilian should they be given the chance to do so. They're looking to adjust their game plan this time around. According to him, a lot of positive things were there for them to take away from the fight, and they're working on building new strategies keeping that in mind. Adesanya's coach did think that the stoppage against his fighter was a little premature, but he went on to add that he didn't think it was a bad thing. The safety and health of Adesanya are his primary concern, and one can only take so many punches to the head. Bareman went on to elaborate that the human body is not designed to take so much blunt force trauma, and every hit does permanent and irreversible damage. Bareman thinks that Adesanya may have made some kind of recovery and carried out the fight, but it meant risking a greater injury, and that's why it was the right call by the referee to stop the fight. It means more for his coach that his fighter is healthy and can live to fight another day. Next up, what is Pereira's strategy according to Bareman? Eugene Bareman thinks that during Adesanya's fight with Pereira, the last stylebender was able to win the rounds. It wasn't easy for him, but he was getting it done. The Brazilian, on the other hand, doesn't really care about the rounds at all. Pereira doesn't build his game plan around landing some damage throughout the fight. He's comfortable in giving up rounds to mentally and physically wear his opponents down. He's calm when losing rounds because he's looking at the bigger picture, and ultimately, he finds an opening to deliver a killing blow to his opponent. Bareman seems to almost admire the Brazilian because he's unafraid of giving up small amounts of damage to land a knockout strike. The nerves and the solid mentality required to do so are impressive, and Adesanya's coach agrees with that. Now, let's look at the history between Adesanya and Pereira. The two fighters weren't inside the octagon for their first meeting. In fact, they met in a kickboxing ring for the very first time. Back in 2016, Israel Adesanya and Alex Pereira fought in the Glory of Heroes 1 tournament in China. The last stylebender outstruck Pereira, but it was the Brazilian who landed more significant strikes that damaged Adesanya. The judges ended up giving the result in Pereira's favor via unanimous decision. Adesanya would later bounce back to become the contender for the middleweight title, but couldn't claim the title and lost to Jason Wilness. The following year, Pereira eventually went on to become the Glory middleweight champion and would defend his title 5 times. But before that, he would face the New Zealander once again in 2017 Glory of Heroes 7. In the opening rounds, Adesanya had the upper hand as he had Pereira against the ropes and was putting a good beating on him. But in the third round, the Brazilian saw an opening and struck Adesanya with a devastating shot to the chin. That immediately dropped the last stylebender, and it was the first time he had ever been knocked out cold. This fight ended Adesanya's kickboxing career, and he joined the UFC in 2018. Since then, he's dominated the UFC's middleweight division and ultimately won the title by defeating Robert Whittaker. Following up, how the rivalry transcended up to the UFC. In an interview in March 2020, when asked about Pereira, Israel Adesanya mockingly said that he had never watched any of his fights and that he'll never be as relevant. For him, the Brazilian was a bitter memory, and he would never amount to anything. He went as far as to say that he'll become a legend and a world champion, and Pereira would only be someone who'll be telling people at a pub that he beat Adesanya once. Pereira took this personally, and 7 months later, signed a contract with Legacy Fighting Alliance, transitioning into MMA. Adesanya has been in his crosshairs ever since that interview. The Brazilian called himself the stone in his shoe, hinting that the last stylebender will never be rid of him. Anderson Silva brought Pereira to his training camp when he was preparing for his bout with Adesanya in February 2019. Silva considered his experience against the New Zealander to be important and even had him in his corner during the fight. Soon after, the Brazilian debuted in the UFC in 2021, and about a year later, he found himself facing his old enemy once more, only this time it was in a cage. Next, let's look at Pereira's title shot. The Peloton went to battle against his arch-nemesis in November this year for the UFC middleweight title. At the end of the 4th round, all 3 judges had scored 39-37 in favor of Adesanya, with him winning all rounds except for the second. The last stylebender had been doing work on Pereira for the entirety of the fight, hitting the Brazilian from range, taking him into the championship rounds. In fact, at the end of the very first round, Adesanya's strike rocked Pereira and was only saved by the bell. Pereira came back stronger in the second round and was able to get some favorable strikes in. The third and fourth were all domination for Adesanya, as he was able to execute his game plan and even mixed it up a little with some grappling. Before the final round began, Pereira asked his corner if he had to knock Adesanya out to win, and Glover Teixeira told him that he does. As you can guess, after that exchange, the Brazilian walked into the center of the cage with only one thought: kill. Pereira had been saving up his energy for this moment, and in the 5th round, he unleashed everything. He went for the last Stylebender's legs with vicious low kicks, and it worked. Adesanya stumbled oddly, and Pereira ended the fight with a TKO, clutching the title win from the jaws of defeat. In the post-fight news conference, Adesanya confirmed that Pereira's kicks landed on his peroneal nerve, which numbed his leg. He also acknowledged that the Brazilian did well in going after his legs. In other news, what does Behrman think of Chimaev? Adesanya's coach, Eugene Behrman, didn't beat around the bush when talking about the potential Pereira versus Chimaev fight. He thinks that it's a no-brainer to run back UFC 281's main card between Adesanya and the reigning middleweight champion. Behrman praised Khamzat Chimaev, saying he's very talented and a massive rising star. But at the time, he feels that Khamzat doesn't deserve a shot at the middleweight title, as he's done literally nothing for the division. For him to get a title bout, he had to fight up through the ranks of the middleweight ladder, and that's going to take some time. Eugene believes that Khamzat has a long way to go before he can come close to the levels of Adesanya and Pereira and plant himself on the top of the food chain. The head coach doesn't think that Pereira versus Chimaev won't happen unless the politics and the business side of the sport take over. Following up, Khamzat's run in the UFC so far. Chimaev is currently unbeaten in his professional MMA career, going with a 12-0 record, and is ranked number 3 in the UFC welterweight division. He's dominated UFC ever since his debut back in 2020, and currently boasts a total number of strikes landed to absorbed ratio of 254-2. His toughest challenge so far in the UFC has been Gilbert Burns in September of this year. That was Khamzat's only fight that has gone to the judge's decision in the UFC. Apart from that, he's always managed to either knock out or submit his opponents inside the UFC cage. The Russian acknowledged that it was a difficult fight for him, and he showered his opponent with praise and respect. Finally, can Alex Pereira call out fights already? The Brazilian offered a bet to Khamzat Chimaev and Brendan Schaub for a potential fight at UFC 283 in a light heavyweight contest. Each fighter will have to put up $50,000 for charity, and another $50,000 if Chimaev can take Pereira out in 30 seconds. Pereira reacted to Schaub, saying that Chimaev could mop the floor with him easily. Schaub said that he meant no disrespect toward the new middleweight champion, but different fighters have different styles, and Khamzat has a much better one than the Brazilian. Pereira and his coaches responded by putting up this bet and proposing that the fight be held at 205 pounds in the light heavyweight category. Behrman obviously has some thoughts of his own on this whole exchange. He feels that it isn't Pereira's choice to decide who he fights yet. It'll be in his hands when he's defended his title a certain number of times and has made UFC some money. He also added that Israel Adesanya's done a lot for the sport as well as for the company. He's also defended his title multiple times over the years, and if someone deserves a rematch, it's the last Stylebender. The cards for UFC 283 are pretty much locked, with the addition of the Teixeira vs. Hill fight for the vacant light heavyweight title. Behrman believes that all of the signs point towards a rematch of UFC 282's main event. This brings us to the end of today's video. What do you guys think about Adesanya and Pereira? Will the Brazilian always be kryptonite for the last Stylebender, or will he overcome his demons to finally defeat his arch rival? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below. Also, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to our channel.